until the present day, where the non-discrimination agenda in the United States, domestic discourse remains largely focused on political inequality. Still, in the past 2 decades, I have to say we've seen more cooperation between the domestic non-discrimination community and the international human rights community, thanks in part to the post-9/11 racial profiling in the anti-terrorist framework. There was an understanding that we needed to look to all tools, and that human rights abuses or human rights principles that were initially designed in an outward-looking manner needed to be applied in a more inward-looking way. So today I want to talk about one site where those communities have come together to make their claims, and that is the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The committee implements the treaty that Eric referred to, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That treaty was adopted by the UN General Assembly 21st December 1965. An interesting moment in history, as you know, we can remember, or some of us in the room can remember anyway. The impetus for the treaty's adoption is evident in its preambular language. After a couple initial paragraphs referring to the principles of dignity and equality inherent in all human beings that are contained in the UN Charter, preambular paragraph 4 states as follows: considering that the United Nations has condemned colonialism and all practices of segregation and discrimination associated therewith in whatever form and wherever they exist, the General Assembly has affirmed and solemnly proclaimed the necessity of bringing them to a speedy and unconditional end. So it's no surprise, 1965, the era of decolonization. But another preambular paragraph, paragraph 9, alarmed by manifestations of racial discrimination still in evidence in some areas of the world and by governmental policies based on racial superiority or hatred, such as policies of apartheid, segregation, or separation. So those 2 paragraphs, I think, give us a pretty good historical context for the impetus for creating a treaty solely dedicated to eliminating discrimination based on race. The treaty required just 27 state ratifications to come into force, and it did so in January of 1969, which was about 3 years later. President Johnson of the United States signed the treaty in 1966, again in the era of a robust civil rights mentality, but U.S. ratification procedures required that CERD be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, and I don't need to tell people in this room getting anything through 2/3 of the U.S. Senate is a challenge, and that ratification then did not take place until 1994 during the Clinton presidency with Eric's involvement. Now, the convention at this date is reaching the point of universal ratification. There are 175 states parties out of about, I always lose count, but I think we're at about 192, 193 states in the world. I was trying to figure out by elimination, but I had a hard time doing it, so I'll have our students take a look at which states have not ratified. They can figure that out and post it on our website. But 175 is a really high level of state participation. By comparison, I know that the 2 covenants have 160 and 167 ratifications. It's an interesting new world that we're living in normatively, where most of these treaties that have been adopted in human rights are now moving towards universal ratification. So we're going to be less concerned with talking states into actually ratifying, and more concerns with getting states, of course, to enforce them. I won't rehash the convention in its entirety, but I want you to know it's extremely short. It's one of the early earlier treaties, and it was cleaner in some sense than many of the more recent treaties, which go on in much greater detail. There are only 7 operative paragraphs. The rest is structures for enforcement, creating the committee and how the committee will be elected and operate. So Article 1, of those 7 operative paragraphs, just quickly, Article 1 is the definition of race discrimination, which Eric read. I do want to point out that the definition, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing rights. So point that out for a couple reasons. First of all, the concept of race discrimination is broad. The categories are expansive, and there are a couple terms in here like dissent that don't mean as much to us in our American context, but have had a lot of attention. That word dissent has allowed for an examination of the impact of caste in many countries, where people who are born into a particular caste or who have a particular name that indicates their social class are discriminated against. Also pointing out the inclusion of purpose and effect of race discrimination, which is, for those of you who are U.S. scholars will understand, is a much more inclusive formula than we'll find in U.S. constitutional cases, and therefore interesting ground for human rights lawyers in the United States.